Welcome, everyone, to the Seeker's Compass. I want to talk a little bit about what the Seeker's Compass is. It is part of All Faiths Seminary International. It's part of our outreach, and we do have multiple programs at the seminary that work on helping each of us get closer to the divine. We have a mystical path that has opened up, and it's been very interesting and very fun to dive into, where we explore what the ancient mystics did. Christian mysticism, Sufism, A Course in Miracles, Zen, Vedanta, Kabbalah, nature mysticism, Sikhism, and more. And every level goes deeper and deeper, from ministers to masters to doctorate, or higher and higher, depending on your perspective of learning about what our mystics did in the past and what are they doing now. And that's part of why we have the Seeker's Compass. We want to have conversations with them. And we also talk about your spiritual practice and how could you increase it? How do you add a little depth to your own practice? And if you're interested, feel free to go to allfaithseminary.org and find out more. As I mentioned, the Seeker's Compass is part of the mystical journey, and it is a series of interviews with modern mystics. And today, of course, we've got Dr. Roger, who's going to be joining us. And they talk about their experiences. We've had some amazing speakers join us, and it's always fascinating to find out what people are doing today in the modern world to stay deeply connected to all aspects of their spirituality. Well, let's talk a little bit about what we're doing today with Roger. We've got this wonderful overview that we've just finished up, and now we're going to have a centering meditation in just a minute with Dr. Keith. We're going to have a back and forth engaging discussion with Dr. Walsh about his mystical path. And we are open for questions all along the way. Hopefully you'll find something that is interesting to you, something that could give you a little bit deeper understanding of your own path, something that could give you an opportunity to go further on your own practice. And again, we see everyone as a mystic here at the Seeker's Compass. We're all mystics. We're all on our own journey. Some of us are very consciously on that path. Some are not, but we're on the path regardless. And our goal is the same for all of us. And I would now like to ask Reverend Keith to lead us in a centering meditation to start our program. Dr. Keith, over to you.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, good, good. All right. Well, we're going to start with some nice, slow, full breaths as we adjust our posture. And our goal is to center and really try to connect between Mother Nature and the divine, and how can we experience that with our breath, and how deeply centered can we become? So everybody try to sit up straight in their chair. Try to sit a little forward so that your ribs can move as you breathe and they're not constrained by as you lean against the back. Really feel the sit bones, the hard bony parts that come through your buttocks on a firm part of the chair. You might have to move a little forward for that. We're really going to want you to feel your whole spine rising up out of your pelvis. And we'll use that antenna, our spinal central nervous system, to we'll quiet everything down and see how centered and peaceful we can become. So let's all start to loosen up those shoulders to begin with. So a couple of nice deep breaths where our shoulders go up to our ears. And then as we hold our breath, we squeeze the shoulders back and then we let them drop on exhalation. So let's do 2 or 3 of those. Nice inhale. Really enjoying it. Filling you up. Slowly letting it out. With each breath, see how much taller you can become from your coccyx to your crown, the crown of your head. Shoulders up, back, and down, really relishing that breath. Nice and tall. Nice and tall. You're growing with each breath. How much can you bring in? Can you feel your lungs stretched a little bit? Very nice, everybody. Looks like we're getting some people coming back. Thank you, everybody. That was wonderful. I appreciate you joining me in that. And I'll turn you back over to Bud, who, is in charge of keeping us on track.
Well, I tried. That was wonderful, Keith. Thank you for that. That was a very powerful, very deep meditation. We always appreciate where you take us. I'd like to just give a little slight overview of and an introduction here. I've known Roger for a few years, and I know some of us have known him for a very long time. He has done a deep dive this lifetime into contemplative practices, religion, spirituality, wisdom traditions. He's looked at shamanism and the psychological challenges that we're all facing today. He's done a deep dive into so many different mystical areas that he's just an ideal person for us to talk with on the Seeker's Compass. And you've obviously spent time with amazing deep thinkers like Ken Wilber, Daniel Goleman, the Dalai Lama, and many, many more. And so tell us just a little bit at a high level, if you would, please, Roger. What do you consider to be your spiritual path this lifetime?
Well, thank you very much, Bud, and nice to be with everyone. Let's see. I think what got me into this and what is still a compelling motive is curiosity. That I didn't, of course, as none of us do when you're getting into onto a spiritual path, you don't have a clue what you're getting yourself into. But something draws us. And for many of us, it's pain. For many others, it's a range of motives or sacred questions. How can I love better? What's the best use I can make of my life? How can I contribute? What is the sacred? And so, I think there are many. We get into onto this path in many, many different ways. And for me, I think initially it was intense curiosity. I had the great privilege of I came over from Australia where I did my medical training to do a psychiatry training at Stanford University. And as part of that, was exposed to a lot of culture shock coming from Australia, which was a somewhat anti-intellectual culture, no focus on introspection at all, to come into a culture and into a training system which emphasized sensitivity to feelings and the exploration of one's inner world, all of which was entirely new to me. But I had the extreme good fortune of going into therapy with a very skilled therapist by the name of Jim Bugenthal. And I did it in large part because it felt like an appropriate thing for my training, but also because I was doing therapy on people and really, really felt I had a moral obligation to try it myself. And I wasn't really expecting all that much, but I got way more than I'd expected. Jim Bugenthal was a superb humanistic existential therapist who was just a master of getting people in touch with their own experience. And I had certainly been very much out of touch with my experience. And through him, he basically showed me that there was an inner universe as vast and mysterious as the outer, which I had been totally unaware of. And I was just shocked that here was an inner world of thoughts, images, emotions, intuitions, archetypal imagery, inner guidance that I'd been totally unaware of. And I just puzzled, how could I spend my entire life and not known about this? And as I looked around the culture, it seemed like, well, not many people know about this. How can our culture be so asleep? And it literally felt as though I'd spent my entire life living on the top 6 inches of a wave on top of an ocean I didn't know existed. And so for me, that was the opening, the recognition that we all have within us an inner universe as vast and mysterious as the outer, a source of inner guidance, of wisdom, of intuition, of depths of possibilities of love and compassion, for example, and joy that just go beyond our ordinary lives. So that was a huge shock for me, and that was what basically got me into exploring eventually contemplative practices. Initially, it was more psychological, and being in California, there's endless list of things to explore, and you name it, I did it. Gestalt, TM, TA, Eureka, EST. It's a long list. But eventually I found myself gravitating towards spiritual traditions, and I didn't have a clue why, because I knew religion was the opiate of the masses, a relic of primitive thinking. So what the hell was I doing with these people and trying practices such as chanting and meditation, which actually seemed helpful? And it took me a long time I really puzzled over that for a long time. And there was eventually a kind of epiphany, literally one moment as I was walking across the living room, when I realized that at the core of the great religious traditions, hidden behind the conventional institutions with their myths and rituals and, in many cases, dogma, were much less well-known, esoteric, or sometimes hidden practice traditions which focus not on belief, but on psycho-spiritual technologies for training the mind, the heart, and inducing the same states of consciousness, the same realization, the same capacities, virtues of love and kindness and compassion and generosity and insight that the great founders and great religious contemplatives had open to. There was literally there were literally practices, systematic practices for these kinds of realizations that our culture just didn't seem complete aware of at all. So that began a deep dive into those practices, which still continues.
Very cool. And, that's been my experience as well. You've said it so clearly and so wonderfully. Yes, there's these wonderful hidden nuggets that are in each of these belief systems, and they can become flowers that open up once we are actually willing to explore them. Yeah, that's amazing. That's wonderful. So, Keith, did you want to add something?
Sure, yeah. You mentioned, what is the sacred? I'd be interested to hear you expand on that. Pretty broad.
Yeah, well, let's acknowledge that first off, the challenge of defining and coming to any common agreement on terms, and particularly terms which relate to spirituality and the sacred. So, and that's an issue with any terms. The problem of definition is always a challenge, but more so here. The way I think of it and use it is, I think of the sacred as referring to that which is most central and essential to our lives. And that's a broad definition, of course. People's understanding of and image of the sacred varies dramatically from some which we would not particularly think of as sacred at all to the transcendent and the deeply spiritual. So that's the way I hold it. Maybe. What about you?
I that's interesting to hear you. I mean, say what you said. It's all, I think, quite appropriate and accurate. And probably the sacred, is something different for everyone. But I think it's really ultimately, just that being able to touch that unconditional experience of love that's just, so pervasive that then, can be brought into our lives and kind of shift the relationships. I mean, there are sacred objects, there are sacred practices, but I guess ultimately what is most sacred is our ability to deeply connect with our fellow travelers. I mean, on that level and share. I guess just that moment of peace and connection. Probably the most. And all kinds of things can help us get there, right? The psycho-spiritual techniques, associations, various different practices, prayers, ecstatic dance. I mean, on and on and on and on. But yeah, I guess that's and being able to bring that to what you do in life. I think that's also helps kind of keep it alive. Yeah.
I see that Jack has his hand raised. Jack, would you like to join us and share some insights?
Sure. Thank you, Bud. And Roger, thank you so much for your introduction. By the way, your journey, Roger, is very much like my own. I don't remember the name you said for your therapist. Was it Blumenthal?
Usental.
Okay. Your story, getting into therapy. Wow. You woke up a whole new world that you didn't even know existed. And the inner world is so much bigger than the outside world that we think we're living in, right? When you see that inner world, it has so many treasures, right? So I relate very much to your story. So thank you for that. In the context of the topic of sacredness, what I want to say is, since this is somewhat of a Course in Miracles community, we have to separate the word sacredness from the word specialness. Now, if somebody thinks their church is special or their synagogue is special, and from the ego's definition of specialness, we realize that is not coming from the spirit. But the sacredness, like I have a sacred place in my bedroom where I meditate. Now, in my mind, I have created that sacredness that I treat in a special way, coming from my thoughts and my perceptions, that is a sacred space that I treat in a certain way to give reverence to the way I treat that space within the confines of my bedroom. Now, that is a microcosm of sacredness in the individual life of me, okay? But sacredness is something that we create from thought of a place or a person. I have sacred relationships with people because there's so much respect and so much spirit and inspiration that we share together. So I think I bring up the idea of specialness to make sure that we differentiate what is specialness from the ego from what is sacredness from the spirit in definition. Anybody, I think, can create sacredness from the mind out in terms of any space or any person that they want to. Now, that's my own thought. Sacredness is a very integral part of my life and the people in my life. And I wouldn't have learned that, Roger, if it wasn't for having a therapist years ago, 30 years ago, to wake me up to the beautiful world that you also have discovered. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, for me, it's quite simple. It's a reflection, a connection, a path to the divine. That's sacred.
Yeah.
See, we've got some more questions, Roger, unless there's anything else you wanted to add to that.
No, that's fine. Thanks.
So on your website, you have these wonderful questions that I'd love for you to reflect on and share. And I know each one of these are hour-long topics, but what does it mean to live wisely and well, and what does it take?
Well, first off, let's acknowledge the kind of question that is. And of course, there are many categories of questions, but there's a valuable distinction to be made between factual questions and wisdom questions. Factual questions have a one-time answer. Is it raining outside? Take a look out the window. That's the end of the question. You have your answer. The wisdom questions are more like koans. They're questions that don't have a final answer, but an answer that can keep emerging and deepening as we open and deepen. So wisdom questions each have the potential, each time you ask them, for taking you deeper into the question, deeper into yourself, and deeper into life. So the question, how do we live wisely and well, is really a wisdom question, which there's no one-time answer. It's a question to live with and live into. And at various stages, we'll have various insights and openings and intimations or guidance as to what feels appropriate or the best way for us to live at this time and the best way to respond to situations and circumstances and people. But the beauty of the wisdom question is that it keeps us open to guidance and the possibility that what worked yesterday may not be what's most helpful today. And so I would say, how do we live wisely and well? You can't point to one specific response. You can point to a lot of different characteristics of it, such as living with inquiry and openness and curiosity, living in a way which one spends time with fellow seekers or explorers, one study of sacred texts. For many people here, it's the Course in Miracles, among others, and cultivation of particular qualities such as love and compassion and generosity and joy. But if I were to break it down, just reduce it to one thing, it might be a staying open to our felt sense or guidance of what's most called for and appropriate in this moment, and living in that way. And in Confucianism, there's a concept of yi, which means both, has the meaning of both righteousness and appropriate. So the challenge of wisdom, of living wisely, for the Confucians, is to find how best to respond to each moment in the way which is most appropriate. And for the Confucians, there's a big emphasis on harmony. That is, that one's actions harmonize with the situation, the community, and with the Tao, the sacred. So that harmony is a key thing here. Appropriate responsiveness is one of their key definitions of living wisely and well. And there's a similar theme in other traditions, though the Confucians are the ones who most emphasize the crucial aspect of harmony. The Taoists, of course, being part of the same Chinese culture, have a focus on that too. And then there's a story from Buddhism of a student asking a teacher, what is it the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas do in every moment? And the teacher's answer is, act appropriately. So act in a way which is appropriate to the moment, and with no without a fixed determination of what that can be. And one of the common themes across sages from multiple traditions, you find in Aristotle, you find in many, many sources, is that the emphasis on living wisely and well is on this attunement, sensitive attunement to the moment, and attunement, both inner attunement and outer attunement to one's own felt sense of what's called for, what my unique response is, and to this particular situation, circumstance, and community. Well, that's one possible response.
It's a very good one, and I think Keith has a few more things he'd like to ask, and of course, John, if you'd like to, feel free.
Well, yeah, and do you have comment? I mean, would you like to answer yourself?
The person who asked the question? Yeah?
No, Keith.
Oh,
go ahead.
yeah, okay. Boy, you have such a rich background, and you mentioned already psycho-spiritual techniques that in many traditions have, and you have experience with psychedelics, and I know you've written articles on self-actualization or realization related to psychedelics and meditation. And also you're deeply involved in the Course in Miracles. So I'm interested in your sense of psycho-spiritual techniques within the Course in Miracles or other Christian traditions you've explored, and how you see them relate to some of the other ones you've studied over the years.
And you're thinking about, Keith, are you thinking here of the different practices within, say, the Course or Christian contemplative, or what?
Yeah. How and how you relate to them from what we tend to view as Eastern practices. But, in my experience and studies, I've kind of found I have very little separation now between Eastern and Western traditions. What has historically been called that, and the roots of the psycho-spiritual techniques seem to be ubiquitous, almost amongst them all, particularly in the more esoteric tracks of all the main religions we're aware of. So I don't have the depth of knowledge in A Course in Miracles like you do, but I've explored it some, but certainly other branches of Christianity, and especially the Orthodox Church, which is closer to the East, has many elements of. So just kind of your experience of those, maybe what you found valuable, maybe even your practices, that you've dabbled with over the years.
Well, there's a lot there. Of course, that's a huge topic, but you mentioned several, very important ideas. The idea of universals across traditions, the idea also of unique focuses and contributions from traditions. And the idea you implied, you didn't quite name it, but you seemed to me to be implying that these arose out of a basic human nature in some way. So yeah, a lot to explore there. And you also pointed to the fading of the distinction between East and West, and the recognition of the shared practices, the shared aspirations, in addition to the fact that each tradition has its own unique focus, and quite possibly, I think almost assuredly, different kinds of realizations.
Mm.
So
that would be interesting to hear more about. Yeah.
So part of any exploration here has to be open to a both and, as so many so many deep explorations need to, and a both and in this case between recognizing and acknowledging the universals while also recognizing and acknowledging the distinctions. And historically we can see the extremes here. We have had centuries of warfare between traditions. Some, of course, have coexisted pretty peacefully. Buddhism, Confucianism, probably, certainly have, for the most part, by no means wholly, managed to peacefully coexist with other traditions. But on the other hand, there's been a lot of bloodshed over the statement, the only true way is. So we need to hold those. And let's say, I can say, you asked about my own exploration here, and I can briefly say that for me, I was pretty much inoculated against Christianity in Sunday school, in my adolescence, and became an intensely rationalist agnostic. And it was only through the opening to the inner world, and first through psychotherapy and then through a variety of contemplative practices, that I began to realize, as I said, that there was a contemplative core hidden behind the institutions of the great traditions. But I found that at the time, when I was living in San Francisco in the 70s, it was that contemplative core was most evident in the Eastern traditions, which were flooding into parts of the United States at that stage. And it wasn't until a little while later that the Western traditions kind of reacted and said, "Well, wait a minute, we have this too," but it has not been as evident. And the reason it hadn't been as evident because the Western monotheisms have, traditions of the book, and the definitive theology and belief systems are laid down there. And in many cases, the contemplatives and mystics, having their own experiences and their own insights and conclusions, were not at all welcome. And a lot of them ended up on funeral pyres and crucifixes, beginning with Jesus. Well, actually not beginning with Jesus, even before then. Jewish heretics were stoned to death. So the contemplative side was not nearly as evident in the West initially, but then the Western traditions started rediscovering, emphasizing their own practices, and we have now access to Jewish Kabbalah and Islamic Sufism and Christian contemplation in a way that just wasn't so available a few decades ago. So we can begin to look at these and draw the kind of comparisons you have, Keith, and recognize similarities. But I think it's important for me, I had to go make my journey to the East, literally and metaphorically, to do these practices, to go to Asia and immerse myself in these practices before I could have sufficient experience and insight based on experience to recognize that, oh my goodness, this is here too in Christianity and in Islam and Judaism. So for me, I had to do the journey to the East first. And the reason for that is very interesting, but and certainly I'm not alone. I think a number of us have done that. The reason it took the journey to the East was because at that time, and still it's largely almost exclusively true, but not purely now, what we are exposed to in our own culture is conventional religion, conventional institutional religion, and what we were exposed to coming from the East were more of the contemplative practices. And so, we looked at the conventional religion here in the West and thought, well, something's missing. And we looked to the East and said, wow, they actually have practices to induce these experiences and understandings and insights and awakenings. And only after doing that could we go back and digging in our own tradition, begin to find, oh, wait on, they have some of that too, except they did away with a lot of people practicing. So it's not exactly a popular path. But that recognition draws on a really fundamental distinction that there are two radically different kinds of religion. Of course, we can divide religion in all ways, just as we can anything, but one radical distinction is between conventional religion, which centers on believing a narrative, a story. If you believe the story, you're saved, and if you don't believe it, you're damned, versus contemplative religion, which focuses on a psycho-spiritual technology for training the heart mind to induce the same realizations as the founders. Now, those are radically different kinds of religion, and unfortunately, our culture doesn't recognize it. So, but once you get that, then a lot of things suddenly begin to make sense, which is, that's one reason we, a lot of us, myself included, had to make our journey to the East first. But once you see that, then you see that, wait on, these are so different. And if we're going to draw comparisons and try to find commonalities, what are we finding commonalities between? Are we finding commonalities between the story, the theology, the belief system? Or are we finding commonalities between practices and insights and openings and realizations? Because those are very, very, very different kinds of comparisons. Until we make that distinction, you just have a mishmash of competing claims and dogmatic assumptions that just go nowhere. So that seems to be foundational for any real exploration across traditions.
Yeah, I've had some sense that there's a little more overlap in the psycho-spiritual traditions, although hidden in the Western practices. As we've seen it come out in Kabbalah, which is a little more evident. But, the Bible talks about the breath, right? The Bible talks about the third eye. The Bible talks about the sound. I mean, in the beginning was the word, the vibration. So, there's mantra, there's breath, there's visualization in all of them. And there's even interesting, postural work, like just the sun salutation is repeat. I mean, the Muslim daily prayer has kind of aspects of that movement, and Orthodox Christians have, some prostrations that they do that are similar. It's just so fascinating to see, so I think of it a lot. So religion, yes, there's the theology part and there's the contemplative part. And, the theology, all the theologians, they get together and, they can argue, and the contemplatives just enjoy each other. And yeah, but you kind of get the difference a little bit, right? It can go that way. Yes. And so I guess that's been more and more of an interest of mine as the years have gone on. Is are we all really tweaking? Because religions start by somebody's spiritual experience, and so how did they get there? And kind of gets lost a little bit along the way sometimes, and in other traditions it's kind of preserved. But it seems that, before we had these screens and Zoom and all of that, people spent a little more time sitting and reflecting and developed those psycho-spiritual technologies, which have roots. I think, there are roots there, I guess, on the Western side as well. So.
Yeah, and just to emphasize the point you're making there, Keith. That I think Houston Smith said it beautifully, that the mystics of different traditions have more in common with each other than they do with the traditionalists of their own path.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He was wonderful. I mean, he really put some eloquent words together there, didn't he? Yeah.
He loved all the religions. It was very clear in his writings how he appreciated each and every one. Yeah. Now, we do have a couple of questions, and I see we have some hands raised here. Janet has a question about your experience with surrender and then while acting in the world. What are your thoughts on surrender, Roger?
I have trouble with it. I think it's a great idea. Yeah. Well, as a very agentic person, for me, my emphasis has been on will and action, and there's a distinction between the active and the receptive in multiple traditions. And of course, we have in the Christian tradition the distinction between grace and good works, and in Zen there's a distinction between joriki, which is self-power, versus tariki, which is other power. And so this is a common theme, and I think for all of us there's an ongoing balancing act. And the first retreat I ever went to was with Ram Dass, and I still remember him saying something which has stuck with me and been a koan for many years, and that was, balance is a magical word on the spiritual path. Those were his words. And it's true. It's a constant balancing act and integration act of and sometimes it's a flow of, there are times, one is drawn to more agentic activity, and there are times when it's really appropriate to let go and release. And of course, the deeper one goes, the more that distinction falls away. But it feels like both have their role, and balance is a key. And surrender, it feels like, I'm thinking of the spiritual teacher Miranda McPherson, who was recently on our podcast, Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. And she has a beautiful book on grace. And she talks about her own life as being, and the possibility for all of us of having grace-filled lives. And she has a receptivity and openness and awareness of that in a way that I don't. So it's beautiful to be with someone for whom that receptive and surrendering aspect of life is just so central. So those are some thoughts.
Interesting. Thank you. Appreciate that. I hope that helped, Janet. So why don't we just go ahead in the order that we have our hands up. Jack, why don't you come forward and share what you would like to talk about?
Going back just a little bit on the topic of Eastern religion, Eastern spirituality versus Western, I just want to say that, when the Course came out in 1975, I think A Course in Miracles in and of itself had a big influence on the integration of Eastern culture and Western culture. In the message of the Course brought so much of the Eastern traditions to us that Western civilization had not integrated at all. And Roger, you even mentioned yourself that you got into contemplative practices well into your own therapeutic journey. It was later in your therapy process that you started to move into the contemplative area, which is, of course, much of Eastern religion. And the Course in itself has quotes that the Buddhists have said that the Course echoes the wisdom of the Buddha And yogis have say that it expresses the wisdom of the Danta. Actually, the Course echoes the words of the Buddha, the Buddhists say, and expresses the wisdom of the Danta. And then in the Western civilization, psychologists find the insights comparable to the best contemporary thought on phenomena such as perception, belief, and identity. And I think belief in and of itself, of course, as we all know, is a separation device. And belief is so much keeps the polarity away from integration. And when we compromise belief and let go of belief and move into contemplative practices and experiential living, I think coming from the ground up, I don't think these big religions picked it up. It really came from just humanity finding contemplative practice in Western civilization. To just get more centered, more, to use your word, more balance, in our own spiritual journey. So that's my little bit. I don't know anything like what you guys know, but that's my little contribution.
Yeah, thank you. And belief is tricky. We can't do without it. We have to all have belief systems, and we need them. We can figure out how to get out of a room if we didn't have a belief that a door was better than the wall for that. So. And they're essential for survival. But I think what you're pointing to, Jack, is the importance of the way in which we hold beliefs. And one of the interesting, to my mind, possibly the most interesting area of research that's coming online in psychology these days is an exploration of adult development and the recognition that psychological maturation can continue long past when we thought it was. We used to think the mind kind of stopped growing and the body stopped growing, but it's very clear that there can be developmental stages of understanding and thinking that go far beyond conventional levels. And one of the things that happens as people mature is that their belief systems are held more lightly. They are recognized as beliefs, and a belief is a thought which we assume to be true. Well, and belief system is a network of such thoughts. So one of the ways in which we mature with our belief system is in recognizing it as beliefs rather than as reality. So that's a crucial distinction. Then belief systems tend to become larger, more encompassing. They tend to become more nuanced. Recognize, what I thought is true, but it's only true in this circumstance or under those conditions. And there's actually need to be more fluid and include other possibilities. So there's an extension, an enriching, a nuancing of our belief systems, and recognition that they're crucial and they need to be open to continual testing. So there's wise and less wise ways of relating to our belief systems and of holding them.
Thank you, Jack. Appreciate that. Dave, why don't you come forward and share your questions or insights?
Yes. Hello, Roger. I'm working on a master's in divinity on mysticism, and one of our textbooks is The Mystic Heart by Wayne Teasdale.
Yeah.
In there, he states there are 3 tools of a mystic are prayer, meditation, and contemplation. So recently I went on a retreat, and one of the purposes of my retreat was to try to understand the 3 tools. It seems to me, as I studied it more and thought about it more, that they're really 3 forms they're together. I mean, they're not separate things. They resemble each other. The centering prayer resembles meditation, and as I understand it in the course, is more like meditation. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I think you're making an important point that that there is an intimate relationship between these, and in Lectio Divina, which is I think of all the traditions, it's only Christianity which gives a specific name to studying text. And other traditions, particularly Judaism and Confucianism, emphasize textual study enormously, but the Christians have a term for the way to study text contemplatively or spiritually, Lectio Divina. And there, as I recall, there are 4 stages. That there's the Lectio, in which one selects a relatively brief passage, because as Father Thomas Keating says, here we're reading not for information, but for transformation. So we select something quite brief, even a sentence, sometimes even a phrase, maybe a few sentences at most, and we really read it and multiple times, and then move into meditatio, which is a reflection on it. We engage the intellect, but in a conscious way, really just allowing ourselves to associate and inquire into the text. And that can open into, what's it called, the affective stage of an emotional upwelling and association release. So there can be a deep emotional resonance that occurs with the text. And then beyond that is the meditatio, the contemplatio, which is moving more into the silence, the kind of centering prayer silence thing. So there's this sequence, and one also finds it in other traditions. For example, in yoga, one finds the Shravaka, which is listening, Manana, which is reflection, Nididhyasana, which is meditation, and finally Samadhi, a merging with the ideas and inspiration from the text. So yeah, you're right, Dave. These two are closely interrelated, and in some ways they're related in a developmental progression.
Dave, I see them as a Venn diagram, overlapping Venn diagram, right? So you have these 3 spheres, not just 2-dimensional bubbles, but spheres, because there's a lot in each of them. And they do have these places of overlap. And of course, the divine is at the middle.
And the purpose is to bring you into the divine, to
Exactly.
bring a union with the divine.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's nice, but I hadn't thought of it that way. But that's a good image for the relationship among practices in general, probably.
There's a place we all meet.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. And Frederick, I see that you have your camera off, but if you'd like to come forward and join us, we'd love to get your insights.
Thank you. I appreciate that I'm not in a place where I can have the camera on. Thank you for this. This is very rich, and I'm appreciating it. I actually would like to scroll back a little bit to something that you started with. And I had a biochemistry undergraduate and a doctorate in literature and religion, so I've done a direction as a professor and writer, and definitely that's led me on a particular spiritual path. Here's the thing. One of the Australians, and here's my question, who influenced me most very early on, Dr. Claire Weeks, who pioneered work in really what we'd call today anxiety disorders, but was then nervous illness. And she couldn't have been more scorned by traditional psychoanalysts and psychiatrists at her time, because in the mid-century, she was focusing on a very practical, no-nonsense, common-sense approach. And my question here, in thinking about that, I think there's a kind of complementarity between how we get our psychological needs addressed and how we can then go on to our deeper spiritual journeys. And of course, we're always moving between those two, and they have to somehow fit together. So I wonder whether for the speaker today, there could be any way of addressing, again, that relationship between, whether it's traditional training, the controversies within traditional training, and how we find ourselves on our spiritual journeys.
Yeah, thank you, Frederick. And it seemed like your opening there was about, and the initial question was about how best to integrate the more kind of Western psychological approaches, and that is the psychotherapy is largely a Western contribution to understanding and cultivation of the psyche, and the contemplative traditions of both East and West, or more generally spiritual, how to integrate psychological practices and understandings into spiritual life. And I think that's clearly one of the questions of our time. It wasn't one that previous seekers faced, because there really wasn't a developed psychology, or no, that's not quite true. There are psychologies associated with each of the great traditions and each of the contemplative paths, but there wasn't a psychotherapeutic system formally established, nor did it have the richness of knowledge and techniques and understandings that contemporary psychology does. So this is a new ground, integrating psychology, psychotherapy with spirituality. And I think you're right. This is a very important area, and one that is an ongoing question for each of us. What's an appropriate balance? How can we best learn from and use and draw on these rich sources of information and wisdom about the psyche, about our being, and how to best heal and mature and awaken. So one can look at this in multiple ways. Individually, for each of us, it's an individual question and exploration. And general principles seem to be that the psychological approaches can be very helpful for real world skills, like getting along with people and work and projects and so forth, and for deep psychological issues and wounding, and for mental health issues, and that for those kind of things, Western mental health really has a lot to offer, and far more than the spiritual traditions do. Not to deny the value of spiritual contributions, but at the same time to emphasize that that there's an awful lot that Western psychology and therapies have discovered about the psyche, and about how to heal traumas, early wounding, for example, dysfunctional patterns of one kind or another. And maybe one of the warnings that comes up that it may be really appropriate to turn to psychotherapies is if a repetitive issue, psychological issue, keeps coming up in one's practice, and particularly if it inhibits one's practice. And I think these days, an awful lot of initially, when the spiritual traditions came to the West, there was some antagonism with the psychologists, thinking, well, what do these people know about psychodynamics and conditioning and so forth? And the contemplatives arguing that, psychotherapy was really pretty superficial. And yet I think over time there's come to be a growing appreciation and a recognition, a very important, this is a pretty important recognition that spiritual practices don't do it all. And that's quite a statement, and quite contrary to a lot of traditional assumptions. But I think it's pretty clear at this stage that spiritual practices are incredible, but they don't handle everything. And one can do a lot of deep practice, long meditation retreats or prayer life or something, and still have unresolved early traumas or defense mechanisms which aren't recognized. And the reason they're not recognized is because unconscious psychological defenses are really unconscious, and you don't see them through introspection. That is why psychotherapy and particularly psychoanalysis, beginning with Freud, was able to identify unconscious defense mechanisms, because the focus was on an interpersonal relationship. And we can all see very clearly each other's neuroses. They're very obvious. Mine a little more challenging. So now we can answer Jesus' question: Why do you not see the beam in your own eye? Why do you see the splinter in your brother's eye but don't see the beam in your own? Well, we can answer: because of psychological defenses. So, the Course in Miracles has a wonderful description of psychological defenses, pointing out that there are actually choices made, but they're made so fast that we don't recognize them, and then immediately the choice is obliterated from awareness by repression. And so we can have these very distorted ways of perceiving and not recognize them. And the way I define a psychological defense is a coping mechanism for reducing psychological distress by reducing and distorting awareness. So basically, literally, a psychological defense drives us unconscious and gives us a distorted perception of the world and ourselves. And it does it in different flavors. Denial just absolutely denies that there's a problem or an issue. Rejection, it's like, me angry? No, but hell, you sure are. All these different flavors of psychological defenses. And again, those are not recognized in the world's spiritual traditions. You can find references to some of them, but they're really not recognized with anything like the sophistication and mapping of the contemporary psychodynamic therapies. So we have this possibility now of this integration of psychological understandings of, for example, defense mechanisms and, for example, dysfunctional beliefs, which is the focus of cognitive therapies, and of archetypal imagery, and some archetypal work, some of which is definitely done in traditions such as the imaginal realms of Sufism or the visualizations of Tibetan Buddhism. But on the whole, we have a possibility of a new kind of integration. We have traditions that are emerging like that. There are more conceptual psychological traditions such as Ken Wilber's integral theory, which lays out an incredibly encompassing, sophisticated map of how the way these things are compared to one another. And we have practical paths, such as the diamond approach of Hamid Ali under the pen name A.H. Almas, or psychosynthesis, or the Comey work, which deliberately attempting this kind of integration in a very practical way. So I think Frederick, you're really pointing to one of the great issues of our challenges of our time: how to do this integration both at a personal level and how to bring this larger integration into traditions and contemplative life and the culture.
I really appreciate your comments because I was always worried, even in the Western context, with things like centering prayer, when people would be just sent into the silence and not getting a lot of direction in terms of how to support what would come up in the silence. I do think that the growth in spiritual direction has been incredibly important. And you used, I think, an important word in coming back to trauma. Folks like Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk have really emphasized the role of embodiment of those kinds of experiences. So I do think we're building bridges now that are maybe less perilous in terms of psychological health than maybe a couple of decades ago. So thank you very much for your response. It was very rich.
Yeah, well said, Frederick. Thank you. Yeah.
And Keith, I think you want to add to this.
Well, I want to support, I think, what Frederick just said, and that is what I wanted to add was the, all of the, somatic practices that have developed in mental health in the last, 30 years. Going all the way back even to Reich and Alexander Lowen, and this has been, kind of a hard path, but to bring it forward. But the contemplative traditions also allow for some introspection, and if the practice really becomes more and more of who you are, and you can kind of play with it in those moments where a defense mechanism pops up, and there's a reflection, wow, that was unusual, or what's happened, the energy shifts. You can kind of start to play with that in the moment, which is really where we need to go at this point. That's that integration is just so important. So the separation is a challenge, but there's just so much richness everywhere now to try to help pull it together. So I think that's a very hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if I could jump in, I want to relate to what you've all been saying. First, back to the sacred for just a moment. The sacred is obviously anything that we find sacred, and you can make anything sacred. I think it was Krishnamurti that said, if you take a Coke bottle and you put it up on top of a mantle, and you go and you bow in front of this thing every day, then pretty soon that's going to be a sacred object for you, right? But that's just something we make sacred. What's really sacred is when we find the sacred in the heart. For example, when you fall in love, or when you experience what real love is, that's a very sacred experience because it's something that is bigger than you are. It's so much bigger than you are that you know that you're in touch with something beyond your little ego world. So whatever that is, whether that happens within a ritual, although I think rituals tend to make things rigid, and that there may be a place for that, but after a while, if you're doing the Mass Sunday after Sunday, some people that may find that very spiritual. I had a guy tell me once that just bored the hell out of him. He was there because his wife was there, and that was the only reason. So it's a very kind of different situation than what I think is so exciting about the Course in Miracles. I once asked Ken Wapnick, why do you think we got the Course in Miracles now? Why did it come to us during the latter quarter of the 20th century? And he said he didn't know, but there was something that he was sure of, and that is it could not have happened till after Freud and Jung, because it wasn't until we had depth psychology. And what the Course does is it brings psychology to theology in a way that's never been done before, so that you can get in there and to work on anger and work on guilt. And those 365 lessons that you do one a day, if you do them carefully enough and you keep looking, it's trying to get us out of our insanity. And it's trying to do it in a very slow, gentle, therapeutic way without necessarily going to a therapist in order to do it, but also with a very divine kind of practice. And just one more thing I wanted to share. If you think about it, it all comes from contemplation, though, because Moses is alone in the mountains when he has his experience, right? Buddha's under the Bodhi tree. Jesus is off in the wilderness. Muhammad's in a cave. First, there's that. I mean, first there is this going within and running into something that's real, that has nothing to do with the external world at all. The early church fathers were all contemplatives. I'm talking about the church fathers of the first couple of centuries before we even had Christianity as an institution, right? They were contemplatives as well. So then we come out and we begin to build institutions. We build forms and we put rules and regulations and creeds and dogmas. And after a while, those things start getting rigid, and then they start getting in our way because they really becomes blocks to the awareness of love's presence rather than opening doors to the awareness of love's presence. And so we have the Protestant Reformation. It's interesting when it happened, by the way. It's exactly 500 years ago. Luther was kicked out of the church in 1521. Well, here we are, 2025. So that's right when it was happening, when all this break. But now we've got a different kind of revolution that are breaking away again. Some people are going more deeper into it, but we're also seeing these other real possibilities. But having a dialogue like this is a wonderful opening of the doors. All Faiths Seminary, that's All Faiths Seminary. And this is the way the future is going to go for us. We're going to be able to look at all things, but the main thing, as Jesus told us a couple of thousand years, the kingdom of heaven is inside you, not in your body, but it's inside your soul, your being, and it's the same place. The Course in Miracles says this exactly the same thing. It's inside you. So just whatever it takes. I was ordained a Methodist minister in 1970, and in 1980 I went to India because I was looking for something deeper than what I was able to get in this institutionalized with all these creeds and dogs and laws and things we had to say that we believed before we could even be ordained, some of which I did not believe, like that I was going to be celibate. But I had to promise I'd be celibate, right? Oh my God, how am I going to do that? Enough from me. Let's go on to whoever.
No, that's all very interesting. But the rigid, the brittleness that comes with ritual, in my experience, tends to develop when the experience is lost. So when those in charge, so it is just belief, and the experience is gone. So it's the experience that's so important, and having that sense of sacred, of love, of connection, whatever that peace, and then that allows to go back to surrender. I mean, I think surrender is a challenge, especially in this day and age. But and I think and it made me think about grace and synchronicity, as I really think of the same thing when Roger was talking about grace and the woman he just had on that had that beautiful book. So if you can, the more in my experience, the more experience you have in contemplative states, the more grace and synchronicity really just start to pervade your experience. And the more you have that experience, then surrendering is just at least moments of surrender where you can intentionally sit and just try to bask in that, breeze of synchronicity, of grace, and wade it, brace it, and kind of just move on, move with it. So again, practice and experience, and being aware of rigidities. Are you doing something that's just not functioning anymore? Did it lose its, it's a dynamic, creative process, right? You always have to what's working for you? Can you tweak it? What is, get the basics, but play with the edges. Yeah, at least that's and boy, being able to have just moments of deep, total surrender is, beautiful. And, everyone should be able to do that. It should be something we can spread. So, yeah, so anyway, a few footnotes on stuff, but thank you.
And we have Michael with a very patient raised hand. Michael, would you like to share your questions or insights?
It's an electronic hand, so it wasn't really hard to hold my hand
good.
up.
It wasn't exhausting. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for this opportunity. I have maybe a different kind of question. There's a passage in the course which has fascinated me for the last 6 or 8 months, and it's in the context of how many other non-dual teachers there are around. And I'm going to read the section. It's from the 3rd chapter. Consciousness, the level of perception, was the first split introduced into the mind after the separation, making the mind a perceiver rather than a creator. Consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. So my curiosity is, it suggests that there was a state of oneness, then there was a separation, then there was consciousness. And consciousness is now clearly stated as to be the domain of the ego. Unless I'm making a shallow understanding of many of the other non-dual teachers who are around, they're saying the arrival point or the finish point is once you say, I am pure consciousness, or I am awareness. So I'm curious about, I know there's a lot of rivalry, like, is there a trinity? Is there oneness? And different language, but I'm just wondering if you could speak to this passage in the course and other non-dual traditions and how they understand, as one gets closer to the oneness, how you understand, or what kind of dialogue might be helpful to me.
Well, I have to confess that paragraph has never been particularly clear to me. And, so maybe I'll turn it over to John and ask you if you have a suggestion, John.
No, that's always baffled me too. I was big into Pierre de Chardin's teachings at the time that I came to about what consciousness was as a whole, or a universal experience. And then when it limited it to the ego, I'm still working on that one.
Okay, well, I'm glad I'm in good company then with my confusion or my curiosity.
Yeah, I keep thinking about that.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that, as best I can tell, the course is not necessarily clear on its ontology or metaphysics. The ontology being the nature of fundamental nature of what's real, and it's pretty ambiguous in a lot of cases, sometimes even contradictory, as far as I can figure. And the course has its it has its errors. Somewhere it says the Bible says such and such, and it's like, what? Where? John, do you know those? Which one? I'm thinking of some. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like, John, do you have a sense of some of that time when the course makes a statement about what's in the Bible that's just not in the Bible?
Oh, I don't have too much problem with that. I'd be interested to look at some of the passages that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But boy, one that Michael's on, that always had me stumped.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
I have one other quick question, seeing as that didn't get answered. Could someone speak to the literalness of hearing the Holy Spirit's voice very early on in the Principles of Miracles? It says, you will be told exactly what you need to know. Now, I have had experiences both in meditation and on psychedelics where I literally heard an internal voice speak absolutely clearly, very precise, deep stuff. And I'm wondering if other people have had this experience, or John or Roger, how you think about the literalness of hearing a voice telepathically, I would say.
Actually, that gets us into very interesting territory. I would love someone to do a study of how different people experience guidance, course's guidance, because it's not clear to me, and it seems like it's changed over time, and in some way, you know. And for me, it doesn't even feel as clear as it used to once. We just one time ask a question, usually get an answer. These days, it's like most times not, but every now and then there's one. Do that. It's like, okay, so. And it's been about important issues, so I'm grateful when it shows up. It doesn't always show up, and sometimes it can feel more like an intuition. But I'm really curious. I know what you're saying, Michael. You're pointing something very important. It definitely gives a sense there's going to be an auditory voice that you hear. But is that true? Does it come in different forms, intuitions, feelings? I'm open to all those possibilities. What about Heather? What do you make of it?
Well, I'll just share what happened for me. So I had been reading the course for probably 20 years and never took those passages literally. And I was able to get into a very serene state, which was wonderful. And then one day I got bored. I said, well, I can get there, but why don't I actually try this listening thing, right, to hear this voice? And I went into this very calm place and got quiet. I didn't ask for anything. I just said, now I'm going to listen. And within a moment, I heard a very clear voice which said, and as a recovering Catholic, it was very, very helpful. The voice simply said, the God you fear does not exist.
Whoa.
That was the whole message. Changed my life in a moment as a recovering Catholic. And then I have to say, the first time I did psychedelics, MDMA, I heard the exact same voice, which I can recognize. And the first thing the voice said as soon as the medicine came on was, your nature is God's nature because you are of God. The second thing it said was, every human interaction is an opportunity to knit heaven back together.
Oh, beautiful.
That's
wow.
very nice.
The third thing it said was, when you accept you are an eternal being, there will be no hurry. And that voice went on to talk like that for the next 3 to 4 hours. Yeah. So and it stayed with me post psychedelics. So I just sharing my experiences. There can be a literal voice from within that speaks English very clearly, is precise, and I can tell when it's me, intuiting something versus being spoken. So I'll just open. I see there are other hands, so we can. But I appreciate you, Don.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those. Those are beautiful. Yeah.
I think, Michael, that both are true. By both are true, I think sometimes it's going to be loud and sometimes it's going to be soft, so to speak. I mean, I did do a little bit of a study on this over years. Wrote a book called Listening to Your Inner Guide, but that's like 20 years old now. And there's been so much more information out since then. But I've noticed that one of the times is when people, under dramatic circumstances, they would hear a voice. Now, what I mean by dramatic, one quick example, a guy was fired from his job. He was actually escorted out of the building, right? And on the way to the door, he throws out, God help me. And he says, you just got help.
That's beautiful.
Followed by, you were unhappy here. You're going to find a place where you're going to be much happier than you were here. So I think that's arranged, but also just getting really quiet after you do throw out a question or you need an answer, it's more likely to come. All right.
Thank you.
Are you able to hear me, John?
Pardon?
Yeah, we can hear you.
For me, it's situational. I worked as an emergency room physician for 14 years. And in cases of trauma, life and death, that voice is crystal clear, loud, and there is no doubt. I hear exactly what to do, and it ends up saving someone's life.
Wow.
And I've had many, many examples of that. In quieter situations, the voice is gentle. If I lose my keys, I get very quiet and I just say, Father, where are my keys? And the voice will say, well, they're upstairs in your pants pocket. And sure enough, that's where they are. And then other times when I'm mulling something over in my mind, it's not a voice, it's a knowing. It's all of a sudden there's a switch inside of me that says, you got to start looking at the problem this way. And there's forgiveness, and then it's a release. So there's for me, a variation from very loud knowing to a feeling. So there's a range.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Right.
That's a pretty dramatic example, having that come online during, when you're in the emergency room.
Can I give you an example?
Please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So a 45-year-old lady, no, here's a better one. 15-year-old child comes in and he had fallen while running at school. And kids will fall all the time. He got up, mother comes in with this child and says, is there anything wrong with this child? 15-year-old is like, no big deal. He's got scratches and bruises. So I put my stethoscope on him. And immediately the voice, it's always in my right ear, says this child has metabolic syndrome and he had a heart attack. He had a malignant heart rhythm. So do a stat cardiac enzyme. Now, that a heart test is for adults. You don't do that on children. So I did that and my nurses thought I was crazy, but it came back at 3.57, it should be 0. So it turned out the kid had what's called a widowmaker heart lesion. In other words, he's going to die. So we shipped him to Boston because he had a positive heart attack. Shipped him to Boston. He had 95% closure of his left main artery. So, but it was very loud and very dramatic. It's like shaking me, wake up, pay attention.
Wow.
Despite what people think, Chalberg, why are you doing a heart test on a 15-year-old who fell down? Yeah. Why would you do that? And yet it saved his life.
That's a really dramatic story.
Really?
Yeah.
You have amazing healing guides, Rod.
So what is the emergency room that you work in? I'm sure many people want to know.
Rod's retired. Sorry.
No, it was St. Joseph's Hospital in Bangor, Maine.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, but a lot of stories. And for me, it's always is how serious is the situation. And I've got lots of stories. That's just one of them. But it's always
and your stories are amazing, Rod. Amazing.
Yeah.
And listening, everybody's there's a theme here, of listening. And that quiet moment. Certainly there's kind of the bullhorn periodically, like wake up, but there's when there's that moment, the listening, just having those contemplation moments where you're deeply listening. So that's
yes,
I think that's a common,
very important. People would say, I was a really smart doctor, and in my mind I say, I'm not that smart, but I'm very good at listening. And that's very important.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Thanks so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rod.
Yeah, it gives a sense of the possibilities. I mean, we're just hearing both these stories of listening. It's like, I need to be more open to these those kind of possibilities.
And John Sunday has his hand up. I think he would like to add his questions or insights. John?
Yeah, well, just on that point there about listening, and I think that speaks to God being auditory. And that our relationship to that, we got to start listening up. In the beginning was the word, so we got to listen to what the words are. But the point that I got out of this, and I just want to acknowledge everybody here, is essentially what you open up with, Roger, is getting in touch with your experiences, with your therapy sessions, and that's been the theme for me coming through this, or the experiences, and it really kind of speaks to this last topic, because my personal, I invite you to comment on this if I get this right. But my personal experience is that the more we focus or concentrate or involve ourselves with these experiences, we'll build the level of consciousness that allows for an opening of this type that the doctor was mentioning in his hospital. But what is that level of consciousness? And that was the question. That was the question, because the only way that can be answered from my philosophy teacher is understanding language. And consciousness is a very slippery word, simply because it's a nominalization. It's a verb being turned into a noun. So, it goes directly to your understanding of what consciousness is and what it means to you. For me, the definition of consciousness from my philosophy teacher is the ability to receive and respond to stimuli. And every form has that. But even much more so once we come to the human faith. Because that speaks to what I'm talking about here. Essentially, is the environment we place ourselves into, body, mind, and soul. Every person on this call here today is evolving their consciousness in a massive degree by just being listening to this content and absorbing it mentally. And so that's being present physically, mentally. What about the soul? How? There's another word, very slippery word. But the soul can be defined in only one way, by what its acts are. That's how you tell what a soul is by what it does. And so essentially, am I going to absorb by my acts, by my thinking, the consciousness that allows me to be in, quote, harmony again, that beautiful word from I think it was Vedanta or wherever, that I heard again today. But it all goes back to my opinion, Dr. Roger, is that my opinion would be like a belief. And what is a belief? A belief from my philosophy teacher is always theoretical, or else it would be a fact or a fantasy, because those are the three aspects of all knowledge. But if I've had the experience that I've had in my own knowledge, that's my own fact. That's my own experience, my own fact. I may be unable to transfer that to anybody else. So what? But it's my own fact, and that becomes more. It doesn't become a belief anymore. It becomes a knowing for me, and for me to express this and understand it, and to have the ability to come before such an esteemed crowd like this and talk, it gives me great courage. And enables me to go forward, that I can express myself and hopefully continue on my journey of my consciousness with the most loving group of people. Look at Brooklyn; she's sending me hearts, and next she'll be giving me a poem, or maybe next time. But anyway, I just want to say I love you all, and thank you so much for this content today. It's over the top for me.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, John. You started off raising an important question. Is there a certain state or kind or level of consciousness that's necessary as a precondition for hearing or receiving guidance? And maybe there's a two-part. There are two aspects. One is, God guidance seemed to be, it's quite capable of getting around our defenses and unconsciousness. And the other is, it can help to cultivate the very qualities that people here have been mentioning: calm and quiet and receptivity and surrender, etc. So maybe, once again, maybe it's both hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Roger. I think Dove has his hand raised. Dove, would you like to share your insights or questions?
Well, sure, absolutely. I want to thank John and Rod and all the speakers here. I raised my hand when we were talking about that line from the Course in Miracles on consciousness. Ken Wapnick, who was my teacher, I actually I put it up and I'll put it up here again. He did a whole workshop called The Dawning of Consciousness. I'll put it up. And of course, it's available at his website, facim.org. You can get it. Here it is. I don't know.
You have to put it in front of your face.
Okay. Well.
Oh, okay. There you go.
The Dawning.
Yeah, it's an audio.
Yeah, and there's a little blurb on the back, so I'll just read it. It says, the text of A Course in Miracles does state that consciousness was the first split introduced into the mind after the separation, making the mind a perceiver rather than a creator. That you find that in text, chapter 3, section 4, paragraph 2. Okay. In the clarification of terms, it's described as the receptive mechanism receiving messages from from above or below, from the Holy Spirit or from the ego. And you find that in clarification of terms number 1, paragraph 3. And there's only 6 parts of clarification, as you probably know. So consciousness, thus, it is presented here not as a structure, but as part of the process of our leaving the realm of oneness and going into the realm of duality, and then going from duality back to oneness through the right-minded use of consciousness, guided by our teacher, capital T teacher, Spirit. We learn to use the symbols of consciousness to help ourselves and others get beyond consciousness back to oneness. I do want to say that I did have 3 very clear times in my life where Spirit spoke to me very clearly. One of them I'm going to share is the one I had back in 2013. I had gone through some cancer and I was going through chemo, and it was too much of chemo, and they gave me a massive dose, which, not getting into that, was too much for my body, etc. Because the dose of chemo that you get, there's a formula, your weight times your height, and that's a universal formula. And I was at the time 6'4". I'm 6'3" now. And those days I was 230 pounds. So I got this massive dose, but I did some research into this, that's obviously a numerical formula. And if you really look at what's going on, if you're an accepting person, and usually people do the course are into acceptance rather than resistance. So they give you that dose because they expect you into resistance. And Dove at that time was a very accepting person. So that was a massive dose. And my immune system went down to 0. They put me in a hospital. And I'm saying after 3 or 4 days, the doctor says, well, you're I can't think of the word, your thing is getting better. And you'll be out of here in a couple of days. I'm saying to myself, yeah, I know I'm getting better, but Holy Spirit, why am I here in this hospital in the first place? The only time I ever was in a hospital, thankfully, gracefully, fortunately, was when I had my tonsils out when I was about 7 years old. So why am I here in this hospital? And I heard as clear as I'm speaking to you right now, you are perfectly cared for. And I came to me, my God, that's so true. I am. The doctors are wonderful. The nurses are wonderful. Everything is wonderful. And there was 2 other times that happened. Once actually was
the voice telling me, close the book already. You can't find yourself in a book. Books are concepts, words, symbols. That's not who you are. Close the book. That was the second. But I also like Dr. Rod, feel that it comes really when you're willing to just relax and let go, and you're guided to go to wherever your lost keys are or whatever it is, But when you're nervous and you think you've lost something, oh my God, what am I going to do? It'll never come to you, but you have to just relax into it. Thank you.
And surrender it too. Thank you, Dev. Appreciate that. We only have a few more minutes, and I would be remiss, Roger, if we didn't ask one of the fundamental Seeker's Compass questions, and that is about your experience of the divine. What is it that you experience when you feel deeply connected to the divine? We'd love to know.
Yeah, I feel ambivalent about that, in as much as there's so many traditions talk about the trap of talking about deep experiences, and there's a third Zen patriarch says, the more you talk and think about it, the further astray you wander from the truth. So just talk about, to kind of describe experiences can feel like it doesn't serve, at the right moment, the right, etc. It can be valuable if it feels like it's really addressing something for a particular person. Of course, as for all of us, there are general qualities, I wouldn't call it opening to the divine, but certainly opening qualities of many have been mentioned here. The value, deep value of inner peace, of quiet, of that kind of calm and that allows for receptivity. There are, if we come up with emotional qualities, there are love, of course, is the central theme for the Course and for Christian tradition, Sufism. In other traditions such as yoga and Buddhism, they would add the four divine abodes, those qualities of heart which are so beautiful and potentially ecstatic if taken to their fullness, that they have a sense of the divine. And those four are loving kindness, compassion, empathic joy, with the joy of others, and equanimity, all of which can be very very sacred. And of course, there's the sense of profound insight that can emerge for any of us, a deep seeing of like, oh yes, which is which is more an intuitive seeing, a direct apprehension. Of course, there can be the felt sense of as so many people have talked about. So it feels important to acknowledge that profound openings come in many, many, many different flavors. They come in many domains of experience and dimensions of experience. And the beautiful gifts that can also open us further into the sacred. So, yeah. And that's what comes out in response.
Thank you, Roger. I appreciate that. And I think as part of our closing comments, Keith would like to talk a little bit about non-duality. Keith?
Sure. Yes, I can add. Back when, 10, 15 minutes ago, we were on non-duality, which is, well, quite a challenging topic. And certainly something that I've reflected on over the years, pretty deeply. And someone mentioned the Trinity and the Word, and in the beginning was the Word, and yeah, there's language there, but it's also a vibration. But, I guess the non-duality piece is, how does it all begin? Is there nothing? And how do we go from nothing to something? What is nothing? What is absolutely nothing? And as soon as you identify what nothing is, there's something else that's identifying that. It's not nothing anymore. And so you have these two somethings, and then you have the energy between them, right? And so that instantly is the Trinity. That instantly is. So you have the two polarities, and you have that vibration between them, which, there's many symbols to kind of, describe that. I think yin yang is kind of one of the, more beautiful ones, especially if it's like a carved one and it's not like black and white or this or that. But yeah, and so when we get those experiences, at least, one way I think about it is when we get that balance, so that vibration between the something, the two somethings, and it just gets so still that we approach that moment where the word began, or speaking of the space-time continuum, where that moment of creation where there's a vibration and then it continues. So going to that moment of stillness, as is talked about in so many traditions. So anyway, that's just I wanted to add that before to that conversation. But this has really been a pleasure today, I have to say. The group was really, everyone had so many wonderful things to say. I really feel honored here today, and I want to thank you all for participating and showing up, and Roger for coming, and Bud for holding it all together.
And since you raised non-duality a couple of times, Keith, I'll just say that the person who's doing the deepest work on mapping varieties of non-duality, because it turns out there are multiple kinds, is Sean Hargens, who and he hasn't yet written it up, but he did do an incredible interview on our podcast, Deep Transformation, Self, Society, Spirit. So if you want to get the cutting edge understanding of non-duality, I'd highly recommend finding the dialogue that he did on the podcast. And
what's the name of the podcast again?
Deep Transformation, Self, Society, Spirit. Maybe you could send it to people if they're interested. And because that was truly an extraordinary dialogue. I usually I listen to podcasts on 1.25 speed. This one I just listened a couple of times on ordinary speed, and just kind of, because it's a big download and very impressive. So anyway, I think you'll enjoy it if the question of what non-duality is and its relevance to practice is of interest to you.
That's your podcast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. All right. That's excellent. Thank you. I put the link in chat, by the way, to the website that goes with. Roger, any closing words for us?
Oh, thank you very much. Nice to know that a group like this, and you're sharing the journey and supporting one another in it, and drawing from wisdom from many places. Yeah, all good wishes for your journeys.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. And thank you everyone for participating. We really appreciate you, and hope to see you on a future Seeker's Compass and some of the other things that are coming up. Peace be with you.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you.